Welcome to Tourism Talk. I'm your host, Mary Hammond, Director of the Paducah Convention and Visitors Bureau. We have a special segment today with an old friend who probably knows more about us than you'd ever imagine, Jim Homberg, who's with the Filson Historical Society. He's with Special Collections. And also, in the last 4 years, as we've worked together, has chaired the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Commission for Kentucky. Now, complementing that is someone new to Paducah that I think you'll really enjoy hearing from, and that's George Lundeen. And I hope you've seen those sculptures in the yard at the Museum of the American Quilter Society. Well, those are George's sculptures, and they're beautiful. We'll be hearing more about them and the history that leads up to the sculptures. And I'm really looking forward to this. So welcome.
Oh,
Thank you.
pleasure to be here.
Thank you for traveling to Paducah to be here and to talk to us about your projects. It's hard to imagine it's been 4 years.
It is, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I know.
Way back when, in those dark years of '01 and '02, and leading up to this, it's great. I mean, it's been a wonderful bicentennial, wonderful things like George's statues that are legacies that we can leave behind us, moving on to the future. Yeah, it's just been a wonderful bicentennial from coast to coast, and right here in Kentucky and right here in Paducah.
I think 4 years ago, as we all started thinking about Lewis and Clark, and you knew that you had studied about Lewis and Clark, and here in Paducah we knew that we had the William Clark Market House Museum, and we had always been told that the Clark family settled Paducah all the way back to George Rogers Clark, being given this area for his efforts during the Revolutionary War. But then William Clark coming through as part of the expedition, but coming back to plat our town and change the name to Paducah. But those, many of us didn't realize, gosh, you know, they didn't parachute into St. Louis. They, you know, they started with Thomas Jefferson.
That's right.
And sometimes between the Thomas Jefferson and the St. Louis, we kind of got lost. But I think the last 4 years we've all learned.
We do kind of lost because it's usually that mouth of the Missouri and westward up the Missouri and across the mountains of the Pacific, and there is that very important Eastern legacy, we call it, because they didn't come from nothing at the mouth of the Missouri, and Kentucky is a very, very important part of that. Half the men were Kentuckians. Lewis and Clark meet in Kentucky. York, who was at the time William Clark's slave, the first African American to cross the continent and back, in the President of the United States. I mean, these are all wonderful, wonderful connections. That's some 1,000 miles of Lewis and Clark Trail are here in Kentucky for that Eastern Legacy Trail. So it's a wonderful connection that Kentucky has. It's a wonderful contribution that Kentucky made to this most famous of U.S. exploring ventures. And I think Kentucky's done a very good job from here in the west in Paducah and the Confluence area to Cumberland Gap in educating Kentuckians and really trying to, really in a way, blow our own horn about what our own Lewis and Clark legacy is.
Well, you've been one who has inspired us to do so.
Oh, well, I enjoy it, you know, and there's a lot of people that do a lot of work, and it's just been a really, really fun time.
Well, I think that folks didn't realize that some of those men were from around this area.
They did. They were Kentucky. Kentucky in 1803 was the West. I mean, the United States stopped at the Mississippi River, and until the Louisiana Purchase and that next great expansion west, this was a frontier state. When Meriwether Lewis writes William Clark in the summer of 1803, inviting him to go on this expedition, one of the things he says is begin recruiting those men. You know, start getting together those hardy young frontiersmen that will supply the meat for us, because they knew they couldn't haul enough supplies to last them 2 to 3 years in the wilderness. They needed men that were going to be able to live off the land, be able to navigate through the wilderness, and that's what those Kentuckians did. So from Kentucky, and really Kentucky is, as I like to think of it, as kind of the cradle of the Corps of Discovery, because in a way this was where that all-important foundation took place, again, from Cumberland Gap in the east all the way here to Paducah and Wycliffe in the west.
George, you didn't even know all this was happening, or are you an amateur historian yourself?
Well, of course, when you do a piece like this, you try to do as much research as you can.
Yes.
But most of the research, like Jim said, or most of the stories we hear, pretty much start in St. Louis. They talk about how they took off with a boat. You don't hear about Paducah, Kentucky. And it wasn't until I got the call from Bill Schrader that I started to learn a little bit more about the early history of Lewis and Clark. You learn a little bit. You know they were in Washington. You know that Jefferson started them out. But there's a pretty good-sized void there on how they got from, you know, I don't even know which airport they flew into before they got But no, it's been great, and it's been wonderful to come to Paducah and see how William Clark started the city, how the whole history of the place has come about, and it's really been wonderful to be a part of that educational process now by putting the sculpture here in Paducah.
You're forever tied to us, you know.
Well, as long as the bronze lasts, that's only about 10,000 years.
10,000
Long
years.
time.
And Mr. Schrader's already been out there polishing it, right?
He sure has.
He has.
He was waxing it the other night.
And it looks very fine. And thank you to Mr. Schrader for helping to interpret our history. He was very instrumental in beginning the flood wall project. I remember when folks came back, Dick Babbitt, when they came back with the Hanks, Joanne Hanks, some folks here locally, amateur historians, came back from being up to Chemainus, British Columbia, and talked about the wonderful murals. And that was great until Mr. Schrader saw them. Then he was really for it and just wanted to see our flood wall painted. And luckily we've got a couple of panels up there, one with William Clark and one with George Rogers Clark. Then, of course, with the Quilt Museum and having a challenge to make Lewis and Clark quilts, and I don't, if you have not seen them, I hope you will during your visit here, and to see how other artists have interpreted in a totally different medium with cloth the Lewis and Clark journey. So it's and how now with the sculpture. So it's much easier to learn history today.
Well, and every community needs those movers and shakers,
Yes.
the doers. You know, Thomas Jefferson and the captains were doers back in the early 1800s about let's expand, let's go beyond our borders, you know, to the west, the unknown west towards the Pacific. And community leaders here in Paducah, like Bill Schrader, who does so much, and the people here, you know, these are wonderful legacy projects that are being left behind, like George's wonderful statue, like the Quilt Museum and that beautiful quilt that the Schraders bought that will be a permanent fixture, I'm sure, in the museum. And the mural, I mean, I saw people yesterday walking around just looking at those beautiful paintings on the flood wall, and to have Lewis and Clark memorialized there. Historical markers, and Paducah has many.
Yes.
You know, they have one now for Lewis and Clark in Kentucky as well, to talk about that specific Lewis and Clark connection. So these are all wonderful things that are going to like George's bronze, far outlast us. And it's going to be an ongoing educational opportunity for not only the local people, but whoever visits as well.
And we know that Paducah has always been a good place for visitors. Not only have they passed through, as they have since the beginning of time, on the rivers and the railroads and the interstate, we continue to attract visitors and have become a destination. And history, the rivers really draw them here, and now the arts. And it's very exciting to be a part of. The Market House, of course, the Clark family gave 2nd Street to the city if we would always use it, that block for Market House. And when it no longer was an open-air market, it became a Yeiser Art Center, the William Clark Market House Museum, and the Market House Theater. And we've seen all 3 of those involved with Lewis and Clark, from the plays that can to the artwork, and in the museum itself there are some nice pieces from the past, including an original map.
Oh, that's right.
I know, we
Yeah,
need to get
I've
you
heard
over
about
there,
that.
both
I have
of you, to see
Yeah,
that.
I've seen pictures, but I got to see
Yes,
that.
that's Penny Fields would be after me if I didn't mention
That's
some of the William Clark memorabilia and historic items that are in the museum.
But it's, you know, it's so important for every community to embrace something like that, to embrace their history, their heritage in so many different ways. And Lewis and Clark, which is a wonderful part of history here in Paducah, you know, it's great for the bicentennial. It's great not only locally but regionally and even nationally. I remember in 2003 as the expedition came down the Ohio River. You know, you all had wonderful programming, and there were people here from across the country
Yes.
that were following that kind of procession with the Corps of Discovery westward, and it was just a wonderful time, and you all have built marvelously on that since then. And so I think it's just, you know, the bicentennial will be coming to an end, but it doesn't, Lewis and Clark doesn't really end, does it,
Right.
George?
No, no. If you think about famous Americans,
Yeah.
you know, you think about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, the early pioneers, as it were, in our democracy. But as far as a kid growing up, I mean, your heroes were Lewis and Clark, Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett.
That's right, yeah.
Those frontiersmen, those adventurers that went out on their own. And those guys are the ones we really remember. And to have some place like Paducah, Kentucky that can actually embrace one of their people like that and have him be in the top 10, I think that's terrific. That's just terrific.
Right.
We need to hear that. Thank you. Thank you. It's a pep talk in itself.
Well, it's a natural. It's a slam dunk. It's a home run. It's perfect.
You were this morning having coffee over at Kirchhoff's.
Yes.
And even 4 years ago, at the very beginning of this, Louis Kirchhoff came up to me and said, there were some folks in here who are following the Lewis and Clark Trail. Now, since then, it's expanded. There is an actual trail with markers through Kentucky, more literature out there. But even at that time when there wasn't literature, when there weren't sculptures to see, quilts to see, flood walls, they were still coming through just because of the land. How and trying to follow, how did they go?
Well, people are always curious about the people that came before them. I know as a kid we used to pick up arrowheads back in Nebraska. We used to go through some of these trails where we would see the Oregon Trail. You could still see the ruts from the wagon wheels as they went across some of the stone bridges and places like that. And there are always those people that really do appreciate the people that came before them. And when you do that, you get that sense in your imagination of what they went through and how you became who you are today because of those people. And of course, Paducah now is right there in that that string of memories, I guess you'd say.
And sometimes it takes people from the outside, let's say, from Nebraska or California or Oregon or somewhere to be following something like the Lewis and Clark Trail that have really studied it and embraced it to help the local people who may have this wonderful Lewis and Clark legacy, but they've never learned it in school. Again, it was a Western thing. You know, they didn't realize their own history, their own connection to that. But once they know, then they can take off and really run with it, as you all have done here in Paducah. You know, you really knew your William Clark legacy, founder of Paducah, and all those wonderful Clark family connections. But once I think Kentucky as a state too really started to explore its own Lewis and Clark connections, you know, we've really tried to make sure that we've done the explorers proud and lived up to not only their legacy but to try to create our own.
Going west, you just about had to come through here.
It was the west.
It was the highway, the waterway, where that's the Route
Ohio was
66. You had to come by
it was
here.
the highway to the west.
If there had been a guest book, we would be shocked if you had come by this way. I'll never forget reading a book and was talking about the percentage of people in Missouri that were Kentuckians. It was like 80% of the people in Missouri were from Kentucky. It's pretty amazing.
It is.
You just about had to come through here. Of course, I tell people with tourism, if you're going from the upper west, Midwest, to the southeast, you've got to come through here, and it's kind of the same thing.
Luckily, they didn't have very good immigration laws back then.
That's right. That's right.
None of us would be here, would we?
That's right. That's exactly right. I was reading the book about Locust Grove,
Oh, okay, sure, yeah.
which gave me a whole different look at the Clark family and having visitors come and not having your maps. And that was just the beginning of going out west, but just even finding your way to Locust Grove to go visit, that you knew it was near the river,
Right.
but you still had to get there. There was still
You had to get
no
there.
path, and that's very close here for me to try to relate. How would you find your way to Locust Grove? When I went there with a map and before meeting and still had trouble finding it. To realize that these Americans went all the way west, just through very virgin territory.
Yeah, I'm constantly amazed, Mary, that how these people found where they were going. I mean, it's like almost like they had GPS units in their heads, you know, and they could. And I've read depositions from like Daniel Boone and Simon Kent and some of these old pioneers and the explorers themselves, and they would almost have total recall of somewhere they had been sometimes 10 and 20 and 30 years before. And I don't know, it was because of what they did that it was ingrained in them to remember, but I'm just amazed that they could, you know, pass by, let's say, the site of Paducah, future site of Paducah, and 10 and 20, 30 years later be able to tell you just almost down to the detail of the dead trees on the shore,
Exactly.
you know, what that site was like and whether it was going to be good for the site of a town, as William Clark obviously knew. He comes back in 1827, founds Paducah. That stuck with him in his trips down the Ohio, out west, here with the expedition in 1803. Their last campsite in Kentucky before they go down to the confluence and then north up the Mississippi was here in McCracken County, just west of downtown. And so, you know, they had a connection to McCracken then, and William Clark must have remembered, and with that Clark family land they owned, you know, he comes back. It was 25 years later almost, but he comes back.
I have to believe that deep inside of our wiring, that we almost have sort of our little GPS system, but our computer memory is full, where we can remember a Saturday Night Live episode from 30 years ago with the samurai or whatever and John Belushi, or you can remember a scene from a movie that you saw 20 years ago.
Oh, I think you're right.
They were remembering the scene that they were seeing,
Yeah.
which was Paducah's riverfront or the trees and just the way they were. I mean, we can sit here and think of Gone with the Wind and picture the trees in front of Tara and the pathway up the front from seeing the movie, and I've probably only seen it twice, where other things are ingrained in their memory.
Well, the only thing they saw were through their own eyes, and it was real life.
Exactly.
It wasn't probably not much reading from novels, not
Right.
much from
Right.
even poetry. I mean, it was what they saw was what was in front of them, and I think the sense of place that's in our brain is very powerful.
Yeah, I think so.
I've seen children where they get lost one place, but they can almost find their way home because they have that sense of place. And of course, animals have that too, and we're not that far away from our roots.
It's down in there. It's way inside. You
But
just it's buried.
When Lewis and Clark took off, they had a couple rudimentary maps
Yes.
that were drawn by other people, and as a source. And I was able to get a copy of one of the maps through Gary Moulton.
Okay, sure, yeah, our
And
friend Gary.
he showed me one of these maps, and we got a nice copy of it. In fact, on the sculpture, the map
Yes.
that William Clark is holding is one of those maps. And it just shows what might be the Rocky Mountains up here, what is the coast, because they did have a good idea of what the
They had a
coast was
coast,
like,
yeah.
because
Yeah.
they had the ships and everything had come through there. But they had very little knowledge of the in-between. And the only thing that I changed on that map, we inscribed the whole map in this piece of bronze, so it'll last for a long time. But the only thing that I added to the map at that point was Paducah, Kentucky.
Had to get it on there. Had to get it on there.
It's going to be there.
If you look under his left hand there, you'll see
There
a
it is.
little
There it
dot
is.
that says Paducah.
But one of the really very important, crucial components of the expedition was their interaction with the Native Americans. And they were always getting directions, and that's something you
bet.
so wonderfully depicted in your sculpture, are the two Native Americans, the boy and the man there, that are basically kind of helping to point the way to Lewis and Clark. And they were always, talking to the native peoples to, what's going to be around that next bend of the river? When can we expect these great falls on the Missouri? What's the best route over the Bitter Roots? And so they were always gathering that information, and without the cooperation and the goodwill of the American Indians that they encountered, they probably wouldn't have gotten too far up that river.
No, and they were nearly always peaceful.
Almost
Nearly,
always.
Almost always. And when I was working on the sculpture, I thought, well, how can you portray that particular aspect of these people? And so when I was working on the piece, I thought, well, you know, if you look at the implements of war and violence that the Indians had, and one of their major ones was a spear. And so when I did the composition and actually had the chief pointing the direction, at the same time he's drawing the map in the sand with his spear, and so the point's down, and it's not at all in a position that you could use to intimidate anybody. So that was kind of an idea that I had when we came along.
That's a great idea.
And you have the Jefferson Peace Medal.
Jefferson Peace Medals on it. And if you also look closely at the chief, you'll notice that some people always say, well, you didn't put Sacagawea in the composition. I say, no, we've got 6 Sacagaweas in there, and it's because I put 6 coins on the Indians' ears. The new Sacagawea coin, which was also done by a good friend of mine, Glenna Goodacre, for the mint. So that worked out pretty well.
Yeah.
We do have Sacagawea in the composition.
You really have learned a lot about Lewis and Clark. With all of your sculptures, are you doing this? Are you researching?
Well, you have to on Lewis and Clark because you have experts every turn you make.
Yes.
And one expert, I grew up in a small town in Nebraska, but the University of Nebraska has a terrific resource for Lewis and Clark, and a man named Gary Moulton, who researched and rewrote, I believe, or condensed.
Edited, yeah.
Yeah, well, edited. I don't think he condensed anything. I mean, every bit of the journals of Lewis and Clark he put back together. And so if you need to...
25-year project.
Oh,
it's incredible, yeah.
He's lived it. I don't know what.
Yeah, he's lived it,
I don't know what Gary's going to do now. I suppose retirement.
I talked to him the other day, and he's semi-retired, but he's busy doing all
That's great.
kinds of things. Yeah.
Now, your book, The Dear Brother, those were letters that were found.
Found in an attic in Louisville in 1988. You know, when we talk about these legacies that we have, whether they're in bronze or paintings or bronze markers, historical markers, another very, very important legacy is our written documentary heritage. And that's why with Gary and the journals, and like the Dear Brother letters, you know, William Clark wrote this incredible series of letters to his oldest brother, Jonathan, who was this archetypal big brother and even father figure to him over this 18-year period. 5 of them during the expedition that were unknown before they emerged from that attic. And they tell us so much about him as a person, but about his world. 2 of the expedition letters are very, very important for what they add to the history of that undertaking. What happened to York after the expedition? William Clark spells it out. What were his thoughts on the tragic death of his partner in discovering Meriwether Lewis? The day he finds out, he's sitting in a tavern in Shelbyville. This is yet another Kentucky connection. He's sitting in a tavern in Shelbyville, Kentucky, having lunch as he and his family are going east for a visit. They've just left Jonathan's house a couple of days before, going to Virginia and Washington. He picks up a newspaper and reads that Lewis has killed himself in Tennessee. And he understandably is very distressed. That night, he writes Jonathan a letter, and then he proceeds to write. Every time he gets news, he writes more letters, and he says, well, I heard, or I got a letter from somebody, you know, and he talks about it. Things like that. I mean, that is history. That's where our heritage comes from. And once those things get lost, you know, we lose something. If somebody didn't know or care about those letters and had tossed them in the garbage, what a tremendous loss that would be for history and for our own legacy and for the legacy of Lewis and Clark. So preservation of the written materials is very, very important because it can help lead to the books and the statues and the paintings and things like that. So it's really all rolled in together. So it is a very, very together important cooperation.
I hope that you will take the things that you've learned that led towards your sculpture and put something down on paper, because that is, once again, you know, Well, there's that sculpture. I hope somebody knows that you worked on it with the research that you did. And it is very important, and it may not seem at the very moment, but it will in those years to come, 1,000 years that statue.
I put it on my laptop.
Well,
Print it out,
print it
George.
out.
We know what happens. What if Lewis and Clark had kept their journals on laptops?
I know.
About Fort
And it
Man
crashed.
or the Bitterroots, they crash. And look, there it goes.
Well, I think that with Mr. Schrader and Collector Books and
Sure.
Schrader Publishing, that there's a real in there. So we're,
Oh yeah, it's always nice to have
That's right.
documentation of the
Yes.
truth, because we have so many historians that tend to want to write their own.
well,
They
this
help
is-
you out.
Exactly.
Well, I really appreciate you both being here today.
Well, pleasure.
And,
Thank you for inviting us.
And as we progress in this, I hope that we'll be continue to learn more about the influence of these men on our lives. Learn more about art and how the sculptures are made, how you took your idea of the Native American, American Indian, and making sure that he didn't look ferocious or confrontational, but putting his spear down and making a map in the sand. I love it how our history is portrayed, and it is so much easier for young people to learn now than it ever was. From these type of programs to touching, getting up there and getting on Noof, on the dog, to just seeing the quilts and interpreting history yourself.
Sure.
But thank you, and I
Well,
hope
thank
that
you
both
very
of
much
you
for
will.
inviting us.
Yes,
Thank
We hope
you.
to come back.
I hope so
Always.
too.
I'll be back.
Oh, I know.
I love Paducah.
Well, that's. I hope that you both make many friends here, and
you bet.
you know, Lincoln Bicentennial is coming up.
That's right.
That's
And
right.
Now, have you done a Lincoln?
My brother has done several Lincolns. In fact, he's working on one as we speak. I believe it's either a 9 or an 11-foot
Oh,
piece
wow,
of
big
young
one.
Lincoln in a standing position. Very beautiful piece.
That's all right. Although I believe Mr. Schrader has his eye on Thomas Jefferson.
He does have his eye on
does.
Thomas,
We'll take
which is one of mine,
Jefferson.
which is really great.
Well, we would take Jefferson
Sure
and
we would.
find a good space. One of our main roads is Jefferson Street, so we would find a good place for Jefferson.
Perfect.
You, like I said, you're both tied to Paducah forever, and thank you for being our friends.
No,
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you for joining us. I hope that you will come down to the Museum of the American Quilter Society, see George Lundeen's sculptures, go in the Quilt Museum, see a quilt that interprets the Lewis and Clark expedition. Make your way over to the William Clark Market House Museum, down to the floodwall murals, and stand right there in those life-size paintings and feel like you were a part of going down the river on your way to the West Coast. So I hope that I'll see you in downtown Paducah. To find out what's going on in Paducah, bookmark www.paducahtourism.org, or you can always pick up that phone and call 1-800-PADUCAH. We'll be there. We'll see you next time on Tourism Talk. Thank you.